Hello, Gary.
Hello, Guy.
How are you?
I'm good. I've just been seeing you, haven't I? You've been over to my studio doing some bass on my
Yeah, I know,
album.
but they don't know that, do they?
Well, they do now.
You know.
They do now.
They do that. I've got a funny little thing before we get started. I've been doing sort of Swedish death cleaning at home because I now realise that the house I'm in is my last house. And so I'm finally getting around to clearing everything out. And I found my diary from 1976.
Oh, yeah.
And which is... Yeah, and it's a lot of it's quite emotional because there's big stuff. You know, my dad went in 76, but this is after I've just been given my first bass guitar, and I actually had to send this entry to Youth the other day. It's so sweet because I got my bass on Christmas Eve, and on January the 16th, 1976, Glover wants to get a band together in my diary.
Not Ian
That's
Glover.
me and Martin Glover. That's me and Youth. No,
Oh, Youth, of
that's
course.
Youth. That's when
amazing.
it started. But here's the thing. But the funny thing is and it's just full. My diary, it's full of all his diary entries and just pictures of the Who, right? Because I was completely obsessed. But what's interesting is that in the address book section at the back, I've just got addresses of my relatives and my friends, and then all of the Who. I've got Pete Townshend's address. I've got Roger Daltrey's address. I've got John Entwistle's. Now this is before the internet or anything. I'm thinking, how did I do that?
How did you do that?
How did people do things like that?
Were you a stalker?
Well, I don't think so.
No, but
I did used to go to John Entwistle's house because he actually lived very near my school.
Obviously, it went around.
He
There
came
was
out
a
and talked
kind
to me
of,
once.
it went around where they lived,
I guess, yeah, because I wasn't in with any fan groups. And how did how did you communicate with people?
I remember when I was a kid, I
funny,
didn't know
isn't it?
where anyone lived, but I couldn't even imagine them having a domestic life. I mean, the thought
That's
of
right.
Brian Ferry actually going to the toilet, cleaning his teeth, just all seemed anathema. It just seemed like that wasn't possible, especially, I would only want to mention Bowie, but quite obviously including him. And I think I cherish that, but we're living in a time when it's utterly different. And I think that's probably why Brian Ferry isn't on social media, in that everybody now has to be absolutely exposed. Their doors are open. I mean, they don't tell you what their address is. I mean, that would be too dangerous. But they tell you what.
Wouldn't stop me.
They tell you what they're feeling and what they're, how depressed they are and how anxious they are. And there's things, and some people don't seem very comfortable doing it. I mean, Brian May obviously made himself very comfortable doing it over lockdown. But Paul McCartney, this is the bass I played in Wings, and he doesn't seem very good at doing it. But he knows that nowadays you've got to be exposed all the time, and it's not the same.
I wonder if you do. I wonder if it's just that the sort of ethos and the kind of, is that the thing is you have to be exposed. And so people do that. And I actually think a lot of the promo and everything, I think the fact that everyone just sort of kowtows to this thing, it's like, I don't think the Rolling Stones need to do an unboxing video. I don't think it actually makes any difference.
Yeah, this has just come from my dealer.
Yeah, we're just going to open the box. No, not that one.
Yeah, but I think there's two things. Obviously, they're kowtowing to what young people are perceived to want, but also the fact that the record companies have not a clue now how to promote an act other than their own social media.
No.
So you say, well, what are you going to do to promote my record? Well, what are you going to do? How are you going to do it on social media? And also, there's another thing involved here, that every record now has to be publicised so much in advance. They call it waterfalling, when they gradually release your records way in advance. And that it's have we spoken about this before on here? I'm sure we have. These are the old man rants that we get into. But you've got to keep the publicity going, because that the week the album comes out is the highest that album will ever be. It drops after that. So I think there's all of that.
That's right. So the reason you do it, apparently, I was just told this week, is it's because all the pre-orders count on that first week of release. So you have to,
So you're tickling people's fancy a long way in advance.
Yes. Well, I'll tell you what tickles my fancy is Wichita Lineman. How's that for a link?
What a song. I mean, to have Jimmy Webb on the show, one of the great songwriters of all time. I mean, I won't do a Bill Frindle, but I kind of will say.
Come on.
I think he's the only person
you want to
ever got 3 Grammys in all those awards of
That's right.
lyrics, music and arrangement.
And actually, it was doing this research, that's how I found out that there was a Grammy for orchestration.
Yeah. But
who knew? Who knew?
But he's a Grammy for everything these days. But just to name the songs for our listeners in case they have no idea, he wrote Up, Up and Away. He wrote, by the time I get to Phoenix, MacArthur Park, Galveston, Wichita Lineman, as we said, Didn't We, which was done by, obviously, Frank Sinatra as well as Richard Harris. I mean, he's written he's written with Art Garfunkel, Judy Collins, some of the greatest songs ever written in the American songbook. But what were you going to say? You said Wichita Lineman, you said.
I was going to say there was a musical point that I know it's quite a song that's of incredible importance to both of us. The fact that as those who know Wichita Lineman will know it has that great musical motif in it, which is da da ba da ba da ba da ba da 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 ba da ba da ba da, which was clearly lifted by Bowie for Starman.
It was, wasn't it? Yeah, it must have been. And I tell you why I think he did it.
Must have been.
In Starman, it's a straight line, isn't it? Get it, which I think Mick does, sort of an octave guitar part, but Mick Ronson. Here we are talking about Bowie again. We just can't get away. And but I think there's a connection though, Guy, obviously, because Wichita Lineman is about, this lineman who's out fixing on the wires, on the telephone wires, and he's talking to his wife who's miles and miles away. I think that's right, isn't it? He's.
Well, I think so. I'm not entirely sure. Something like that. Yeah.
The power lines.
I mean, is he working on the phone, or is he an electrician? This is something I want to ask
communicating with his wife, I think, who's a long way away from home, and of course, Bowie is communicating, or the alien was communicating. Starman was communicating with Earth. So that motif, is actually Morse code, surely. What is it?
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, that I see that. Yeah. It's also very close. I realised that, and this is something that Jimmy Webb uses a lot, which is what we know as the Pearl and Dean.
Well, that was it. Maybe that was it.
He used that. It's all over MacArthur Park. It's all over. Used a lot on it. Because funnily enough, Pink Floyd have been known to use it. In fact, they use it in. There's a bit in Us and Them, which is referred to as the Pearl and Dean bit.
Oh God! So who was first, Jimmy Webb or Pearl and Dean? Who wrote the Pearl and Dean theme music?
Yeah,
I don't want to ask him that. In case he just
no. He's not. No, Pearl and Dean's an English thing. He's not going to know what it is. It will mean nothing to him. It's like asking him about the films of Norman Wisdom.
Should we get him on?
Welcome to the Rockonteurs.
Okay, guys, I'm ready.
You know this thing about the 10,000 hours of experience? When we recorded Arnold Lane, we'd done about 50 hours.
I love the fact he's dancing to it naked. Like, it's so hedonistic. It's so liberating. How brilliant.
We knew the moment that the five of us were in a room, like the first three chords, it was like, oh, we finally all found each other.
I'm in a band now. It's called Roxy Music.
He started playing that as his main guitar. So it was his main guitar, so I just said, you can have it.
Thank you guys for still being around, still making music, still being into it, and doing this podcast. It's fabulous.
Everyone in the band was completely disengaged from their partners while we made Rumours.
That's a big tune for sure. I actually wrote that originally for Tina Turner.
The Rockonteurs podcast with Gary Kemp and Guy Pratt.
Keep on rocking!
Yay!
Hello.
Hey, Jimmy, I'm Gary.
Hey,
Hi.
Jimmy, I'm Guy.
We met before, Jimmy. I came to see you play at Ronnie Scotts, and then I bumped into you in the. I was going to do an interview for Radio 2 and BBC.
Well, yeah.
And you were sitting. We had a brief chat.
Ronnie Scotts. That was a few years ago, right?
Yeah, it must be 10 years ago, maybe.
Yeah.
Everything's. I never know how long anything is now.
You know what? Yeah, but I played there twice. So maybe it was 10 years ago. I like that place. I really enjoyed playing there.
It's nice, Ron. It's proper old jazz. Did you have to do 2 sets?
Yeah. I mean, I like playing the jazz clubs and the blues clubs and things. Mm-hmm. People always. I think that they think that I'm, maybe being a little duplicitous, but I say that I prefer smaller audiences, but I've spent a lot of time in front of 200 or 300 people, and I really, really like that. I'm close to them. I can actually feel them. I feel their reactions. I can feel the room.
Oh, no, I know exactly.
I can feel the room getting warmer. I pretty soon I have a relationship with, oh, that girl. I remember the blonde. She's over there. Mm-hmm. And pretty soon it becomes a communion. And I miss it I'm not on big stages very often.
It's where to begin with you, Jimmy. I've got a sweet story I want to tell you, actually, at some point. I wonder if this is something to do while we're waiting for Gary.
Sure.
Which I don't know if you know that I work with David Gilmore a lot. I have done for nearly 40 years. And I was driving along with him once in the country, and Wichita Lineman came on the radio. And of course, we shut up as one does when that comes on. And it came to the guitar solo. And I said to him, "What is that, David?" And he just saw it and he went, "That is a Gretsch Falcon through a magnetone." I thought, "Oh, okay, you say so." And then we got back to his house, and his house in the country. And I was just walking past his studios upstairs in an outbuilding. And I heard this, and I went up, and he had a Gretsch Falcon plugged into a magnetone. Just to see if that was it.
Well, do you think do you think that was it?
I don't know. I think the magnetone sounds right. I know that Glen Campbell, whenever he's played it on TV or anything, or the one most well-known clip, he's actually playing a Fender 6 bass.
Yeah. He probably had that one just sitting on stage so he could play that solo,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Because he used to play a Gretsch a lot, Glenn. I know. I think.
Yeah, I have some recollection of a conversation with him where he said that he had tuned his guitar down that day to play that. But I don't know whether that's a false memory or
because there's a story about that, isn't there? Because you felt the song was unfinished.
I had an uneasy feeling that maybe there wasn't enough there. I mean, there's a handful of lines. There's like 2 fairly short verses. Normally, my impulse would go right into a bridge. And for some reason that day, it was late in the day, and they wanted it. He was in the studio. They were very anxious to get it. And they called me several times. I was working on it. So now it's like about 5:30. And I'm going, I can't stand this song anymore. And I took it and I put it in a brown manila envelope and sent it down to Western 3, which is where he and Al DeLore were going through cassettes is what they were doing. And I put a little note in, "Dear Glenn, I don't think this is quite finished, but let me know if you want me to keep working on, that kind of thing." And the smiley face and, Jimmy. I didn't know him real well at that time. But so down to the studio it went, and I didn't hear anything back. Usually you get some sort of a ping, but nothing back. And I thought, well, I guess they didn't like it. And I talk to these youngsters every once in a while. I tell them, the first thing you have to learn is to accept a turn down with grace and move on to the next thing. You don't call up people and yell at them and say, "Why didn't you like my song?" That's ridiculous. Of course you don't do that. So the first thing you do is you learn how to handle that rejection. So I was fine with it. I walked into the studio and he was there that day, Armin Steiner's at Yucca and Argyle, and I walked in and he was sitting there playing with his guitar. I said, "Hi, Glenn." He said, "Hi, Jimmy." And I said, "Listen, no worries about, the song. I mean, don't be uneasy." I said, I'm really used to turn downs. 90% of a songwriter's life is really something being rejected. And so I said, "Don't worry about that." He said, "You mean Wichita Lineman?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "We got that." And I said, "Oh," I said, "Well," I said, there was a little note that came along with that, It said, "Dear Glenn, I'm not sure this is finished, blah, blah." He said, "Oh, yeah." He said, "It's finished now."
So he because where that third verse was, or the bridge, or the middle eight, he put that guitar solo.
Yeah. And took me aback just a little bit, but then I thought, look, this guy knows what he's doing. I mean, you think about it, hundreds and hundreds of hit records he played on, and he played, most people don't know this, but he played a very strong producing role. He would come in with the gang, Al and Joe and all the guys, and come in.
Yeah, that's the record.
Yeah, they would
in case any of our listeners don't know, Glenn was a guitarist in the Wrecking Crew.
Sometimes the producer comes in with a piece of paper like this, and it's got a few lines on the back of it, and it's like, so what? Where's the song? And in those days, 60s, 70s to some degree, they would make up a record on the spot, those guys. And so a lot of the records that were hits. And so they were sort of, it's like, okay, well, we've got a few lines here. You come up with a lick.
Well, that's the Nashville way, right?
Yeah, Glenn was great at intros. I mean, you got to listen to Southern Nights, that thing he worked out on Southern Nights.
Yeah.
In fact, he played the intro to the Association's Along Comes Mary.
Did he? Because that was a big inspiration for you, wasn't it? For the writing of Up, Up, and Away.
It was a specialty of his, but generally speaking, he was a record producer. So these guys, they would come in with a piece of paper with a couple of lines on it and walk out with a hit record. That's not a bad deal, I mean,
but you never wrote that quickly ever, though. I don't think. Probably did you? Or
well,
was that under pressure feeling?
I don't think that it's certainly not a contest of speed. I never bragged about how fast I wrote a song, but when I was young, crank them out pretty good. I could do 3 or 4 songs in a week easily.
Yeah. But would you write ever under pressure? Would you write under pressure like that with other musicians around you, or do you prefer to be in a room on your own?
No, I could never do that, and I could never write songs in the studio with people sitting and waiting, and the equipment on and humming, and in my mind the counter's going like, okay, $300, $400, $500, $600. Wow, $1,000. This thing ain't finished yet. Yeah. I couldn't write under that. That's too much pressure for me. Now I write one song in 3 or 4 weeks.
Yeah. Okay.
But your songs are pretty complicated. They always have been. But what
were you going to say, Guy?
Well, no, I was just going to say that thing you were talking about not being able to write in the studio. I was going to say we had Mark Knopfler on the other week, who owns probably the greatest studio in the world these days. And he said something quite interesting. He said that we asked him if he writes in the studio, and he said no. And it's a respect thing, because to me, it's always been, it's the recording studio.
Yes, absolutely. So part of it is really, and we can move on quickly, but part of it is having the reverence for the process, so that you really do make it a point of honor and professionalism to be prepared when you go into the studio, not go in and say, well, what are we going to do tonight? And, that's nothing against the Beatles or anybody like that. I remember the Association one time in LA, the Association, and at first it was a rumor, and then it finally turned out to be true, that the Association had spent $1 million on an album. And everybody in town were like, hey, man, have you heard, the Association, $1 million, the first $1 million album. And it was amazing the way studios threw money at without very much supervision. There was never anyone from the studio, from the record label. I never saw anybody like that around the studio. So it was just kind of, spend as much as you want.
Yeah.
I mean, those days are
because you're paying for it ultimately.
Yeah.
Yes, ultimately you're going to pay that money back.
You mentioned Al DeLaurie. You mentioned Al DeLaurie, who produced Wichita Lineman and obviously Galveston, and By the Time I Get to Phoenix as well. But while we're on Wichita Lineman, let's talk about that, because that production totally captured the vision, it seemed, that you had in the lyrics. And when I say production, I mean arrangement. How did it make you feel when you heard that?
Well, I played on it a little bit. I played the organ, the kind of like ethereal, sort of floating communication satellite sounding thing. I found a setup on my Gulbranson 700 series organ, as church organ, and we didn't have synthesizers, but it had this great delay, kind of a tremolo effect on it. And so I remember one day we were at the house, and I said, See, what does this sound like to you? You know, and it was just two notes up, and then two. It was like a fifth, and then a fourth, up and down, making this sound. And Glenn said, "We got to put that on the record." He's stuck up in my music room, and I said, "Glenn, you know this organ weighs like at least 1,000 pounds. You know, it was a big church organ, probably weighed about 500." And he said, "That's all right." And he went over and he said, Shorty, he says, "Bring the truck down here." You know, he's talking to SIR. So Shorty came down with the truck. The organ went on the truck. We all went down to the studio, plugged it in, and I played this little riff on the organ. So I'm actually playing on it. I actually shouldn't claim that because it was so.
Well, because I've heard you say that. And I've made a point of listening out for it, yeah. And it's that, and it's at the end of the song, right? It's not the, and it's so sudden, and it just seems. I just would have thought if you've got an organ that big and you've gone through the trouble of putting it on the truck and everything, I'd like turn it up a bit.
It's on the intro as well, I think.
Well, that was Al's department, but I want to address Al for a second. He's often the kind of unrecognized hero behind those records, which I get a lot of credit for having written a song. But the fact is that he was ahead of his time, and he had regarding the strings, because we were talking about strings. The first time I heard them, you know, I was bowled over, but I always am. The orchestra just does that to me. Mm-hmm. It just makes chills run up and down my body. But Al was a visionary arranger because he was into minimalism like a long time before Paul Buckmaster and some of those guys who worked with Harry Nilsson, Richard Perry. And Paul was great, but Al, those are very sparse arrangements. You know, there's not a lot going on there. There's not you won't hear many glissandos or any ornamentation or the kind of like trills and things that string writers like to use because they sound very impressive. But listen to Al's string arrangements, and you just hear long notes that kind of paint a picture of that kind of desolate landscape, that kind of flatness, and so he was. It really, the first time I heard it, I thought, well, he's not, the parts, and it's not like a Grammy Award-winning arrangement. But the truth is, he was way ahead of his time. Mm-hmm. And he had a very tasteful approach to, well, then we would bring Bud Shank in, you know, who played flute, and who played on California Dreamin' and, you know, virtually everything else. Mm-hmm. But we'd bring the Bud in, and he could play anything he wanted. He did. So all these like carefully crafted string lines, and then there's a flute player going, we're going all over the place. I mean, you know, there was some strange contradictions. There was so much going on, so much music, so many players. There was a guy named Mike Dacey who used to play strictly volume control guitar. And
wow. Like a pedal steel sound.
Yes, just for those out there who might not know, if you sound the string on the guitar and the volume control knob is at 0, you don't hear anything. But if you crank it in, then that note kind of comes out of nowhere. Like that. Yeah. And it does sound a bit like a pedal steel. You can't really sometimes you can't get the exact sound, but Mike Dacey was an adjunct to the Wrecking Crew because he could do that.
Wow.
I see.
So So he got to be in the club because he was like an expert at that.
Just tell us a bit about your writing process for that song. I know we've jumped ahead slightly because your first big song was with Glenn was By the Time I Get to Phoenix, but what was the writing process for Wichita Lineman? The inspiration.
Well, we had talked about it early, and he said, "Can you write me another song about a town?" And I said, "Well, Glenn, I'm kind of getting away from towns,
because that is very much your thing, isn't it? I don't know if anyone's written as many."
Yeah, well, I didn't
You're
want
the town
to write
guy.
And he said I was the town guy. Yeah. It was my Rand McNally period. And so I said, well, he said, he didn't like my answer, and he said, well, that's too bad. He says, he says, how about something geographical? He always looked on the bright side. The cup was half full with Glenn.
And he was immaculate, Glenn, right? Immaculate all the time.
That's why I loved him so much. And I said, well, yeah, I could do that. I said, let's try geographical. And I started thinking about those vistas, which are very cinematic. Mm-mm. And I think that to some degree, I went into Wichita Lineman wanting to portray that somehow in an audio, and somehow capture in a kind of a tone poem, if you will, make the song kind of sound like that country. Mm-hmm. Because that's where I saw the guy. That's where I saw the lineman up on a telephone pole up in I think it was the Texas Panhandle, because I was on the way to Hamburg.
Wasn't actually Wichita.
No, well, it was. I was writing about Wichita, Kansas, which is just across the border. But there is a Wichita, Oklahoma, and there's a Wichita, Texas, because they were a very important tribe of Indians at one point until they'd been, summarily wiped off the map, which is, like an old American custom. And it's a sad one. I come from Native American heritage myself. I don't look it.
Oh, well.
But I'm a card-carrying Cado.
What that's made me think about is the fact that we're now talking, late 60s. And there was a big uprising against the American government and against Nixon and against Vietnam. And you yourself were a hippie living in California. And yet you're writing songs that in a way are preserving the American dream, the Americana, symbols of Americana. Glenn was definitely, that guy.
Yes.
And listen, we've absolutely, your songs have won over the years, but how did it feel for you? Did you have certain contradictions inside?
I had a lot of issues. I wanted to be in a rock and roll band. The first album that ever saw the light of day was a bunch of demos I did with a band that I put together that was an ersatz Rolling Stones kind of a thing. And when I started, I was a terrible singer. Now I'm a passable singer. But I had cut all these demos, and believe it or not, that album came out right after Up, Up and Away was a hit. And I think it poisoned the well for me, because people thought that's the way I sounded. I didn't sound like that at all. But anyway, I think I was partly responsible for Glenn's success, but I know that he was partly responsible for my success. And people would usually say, boy, without those songs of yours, man, he wouldn't have done nothing. Well, that's not true. He had a hit record with Turn Around, Look at Me about 10 years before that. I heard it when I was a kid.
Oh, yeah. Do you know, I just wanted to, there's one last thing on Wichita Lineman I wanted to ask before because we're widening up the, and it's a pretty prosaic question. It's pretty dull, but it just intrigues me was that when you wrote that song, did you do any technical research into the phone lines and what being a phone man is? Because there's just those little terms of looking for an overload and taking the strain.
All right. Well, now you've opened a can of worms, which was inevitable, really. Here's the thing, guys. I didn't know Shinola about being a lineman at all. and the fact that power poles carry sometimes two different kinds of wiring, but most of the time they're on separate poles. Like high voltage wires are on one set of poles, and telephones are on another, and maybe sometimes it's complex. I've never understood it, but the lineman know that I got. They know I didn't get it right, and they somewhat grudgingly say, "Well, nice song, but you need to go climb some poles and look at and find out how this works."
Yeah,
but that's poetic. That's poetic license, right? I mean,
yeah, absolutely.
So I got a couple of little things wrong, a transistor out of place or whatever. When you plunge into writing a song, very rarely do you stop creating to do research. If it's something you happen to know a lot about, if you were raised on boats, it's just like Sting. Sting has a lot of innate, affinity with the ocean and ships and things like that. It could speak freely about maritime matters. I'm not exactly bereft of a kind of general knowledge of science. I'm a scientific guy, but I got that wrong. It didn't seem to make any difference.
It doesn't make any difference. No. My point earlier was about about you feeling like you were doing the business for a time when the youth and the left were very much against what was going on in Vietnam. Did you ever feel?
Yes, I'm glad you looped back on that. Yeah. Okay. Yes, I had identity crisis because I went off and said that I had wanted to play rock and roll, and that's where I lost it. And thanks for getting me back. But I think that I would just like to point out to anyone who might be listening and curious about these matters that when I started writing songs, there was a pool of songwriters, guys who wrote songs, and there was a pool of guys who sang songs. And like church and state, never the twain shall meet. Mm-hmm. The songwriters would go to the singers like Bobby Vinton or Bobby V or Andy Williams or whoever it might have been at that time, early 60s. And we would display our wares, and they would decide whether they would record a song or not. And if they rejected it, we would write another one. But the two pools, to say, until the Beatles, they were, even though you had guys like Dylan, who was a singer-songwriter, no two ways about it, Howlin' Wolf, John Lee Hooker, all these guys were singer-songwriters long before anybody thought of that word. But the Beatles made it official. Mm-hmm. After the Beatles and during the Beatles, those two groups of people began to merge into one group, singer-songwriters. And I was somewhere in the middle there because I grew up a pure songwriter. You have to do it this way. You got to do it yourself. You got to write everything out. You got to have a plan. You got to know a chorus is a verse, a bridge, a lead in, or a ramp, we used to call them sometimes. We had a name for everything. I mean, it was like an arcane. It was like being in the Masons or something. I mean, your mentor, you would be mentored and taught. Like, I got into arranging because of Marty Page. He's the guy who wrote the strings for Modern Sounds in Country and Western Music. Ray Charles is epic.
His son's in Toto, right? Wrote all the big Toto.
Yeah. David Page, lovely child. I remember
he was.
I remember him at 12 years old, like coming into the Fifth Dimension sessions and just standing there and soaking it up. Man, he turned into some fine piano player, though. I love him. I love that kid. And his father was just, he would say, a lot of guys are very secret about what they're doing, but Marty would say, here, come on over. I want to show you my score. And he'd show me what he did with all the instruments and stuff. So there were different Some people were very aloof and difficult. Some people were just angelic. They were just. So here I am, really, with one foot in the traditional pond. Part of me is just a songwriter, and part of me is now looking at these singer-songwriters and saying, first of all, they're making all the money. Second, they have like the business model from heaven, from God himself. They strap a guitar on their back, they get on a plane, they fly somewhere, and they get paid. Then they go home. No band, no bus, no anything. So there's a new paradigm there where it becomes, if you're young, and you think you're not ugly. There's nothing wrong with you physically. You're pretty much look like a lot of other people. Mark Lindsay and me and Mike Curb and a couple of other guys, you couldn't tell the difference between us if you put us all in a crowd. Same hair, same, facial features, same everything. You start looking over there and saying, why can't I be one of those? And the first thing that crops up is, well, because you don't sing for what. And yet I set that as a goal. I'm gonna have a hit record as a singer and as a rock and roll musician. And I spent my life doing that and never did it, never succeeded. But along the way, I wrote a lot of, I would say interesting material, and a lot of it bled off into different artists and things. I mean, I have a song by Rosemary Clooney called "Time Flies," and I have a song on Lowell George's solo album called Himmler's Rain. So I mean, I was spread out, and nobody's ever.
Judy Collins, that's a great song. The Moon is a Harsh Mistress.
The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, and different things that were really spun off of my records. And so even though I wasn't selling a lot of records, I began to think, well, it's worthwhile because, these are really functioning like demos for me.
Yeah. We should. I know we sort of started towards the end here, but it would be good to go back on. Well,
before we get to the end, I want to say that I love Mark Knopfler. He's a wonderful guy. He was so kind and wonderful to me, and came in and played the boom 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 boom.
Oh, did he?
Came in and played that on an album for me down in Nashville. He gets that sound. He can do that sound like nobody's business. It's like falling off a log. But if I haven't ever thanked you, Mark, and told you how much I love you, and I haven't seen you for a while, but I have to get that on tape.
Oh man, we'll make sure he gets that.
Make absolutely sure that gets to him.
Okay, thank you.
What a lovely job you've just given us. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you. Are we done?
No.
I hope we're not. No.
I hope not. Unless you want to be.
I wanted to talk about right at the beginning because obviously you grew up in Oklahoma. You're very much embedded in the church, and you were taught church piano, and that's how you became a pianist, this great pianist that you are through playing in church, right? And
yes, my mother put me on the piano bench when I was 6 years old. I'm going to show you just something. Hold on, okay. I'm sorry about that, guys. My mother used to have one of these.
That's an egg timer with a right.
Like a chicken, right?
It's a chicken egg timer. Brilliant.
You sort of set it like that, and then it sort of sits there ticking away ever so slightly.
Yeah.
And then eventually it goes, which means now you can get up and stop playing the piano.
Wow.
Because if you stop before you hear that, you're going to get hit with a stick, Oh
my God.
She was really strict about practicing, and I didn't really like playing music very much until I was 12 years old. But listen, the church, there's no substitute for church when it comes to teaching people how to feel music, because church is such an emotional experience. And for many, in that day and age, almost all kids went to church and they felt something. Maybe they didn't get saved. Maybe they didn't even believe. But there was something. There was a connection they felt in church, and there was an inspiration, and there was like a lump in their throat. There was a feeling in their stomach. There was some reaction because
I don't think that's necessarily true of church over here. I think, and that might be more of an American kind of revivalist gospel type thing.
When I quit drinking 25 years ago, I started the day with the Rafe Vaughan Williams hymnal. Found it like absolutely like.
I know you mean everyone loves a hymn, yeah. But I guess I was thinking of our view of American church is very different to our.
Now I'm now my father, who was a minister, also had joint services with the black congregations, and when they came over, they would bring their drums and guitars, and it was like whoopee, you know.
Yeah,
I loved going to church with a band on stage, and it was like a dream come true. But my father was very advanced in that regard, and we had, even at that time, it was a very sensitive time, we had a gay couple coming to our men, two men who I went to college with, and my father defended them. The deacons came into his office one day and said, "We're not going to have these kids, these people sitting in our church." And Dad said, "Well, you've almost got that right, but it's you that aren't going to be sitting in the church." He did away with those deacons.
Good for him.
So my father really stood for things, played the guitar. I've got one recording of him singing "Red Sails in the Sunset." That was one of his favorites, right? He came back from World War II with all these war songs and this old silver.
But Jimmy, you wrote a war song too, right? Galveston's
I did.
War song,
well, Galveston is my war song, really. Even though I wrote a lot of anti-war stuff, but again, we're back to that dichotomy of identities, because you had to be a card-carrying pacifist hippie to claim your place among the rock stars of the era.
The cool kids of Laurel Canyon. Yeah. You really, and I lived in Laurel Canyon. I lived, the first house, if you make a left turn and go up Laurel Canyon, 3 houses, there's a white house, and that was my house. I used to walk to the Canyon store and get my groceries. And
Guy collects rock stars' addresses. He'll be going up to see it. Sorry, it's a conversation we had earlier.
I lived on Benedict Canyon, so I know this.
Oh yeah. Well, that's a whole culture up there, right?
Yeah.
So the only thing is, when they made the documentary Laurel Canyon, they put Joni in, and they put, I don't know who all, David. I didn't even know that some of the people that were living there, obviously, but they didn't put me in. So that's so officially, I wasn't in Laurel Canyon. I wasn't a part of that. But really, in my life, I spent a lot of time with Joni Mitchell as friends, and most of the rock and roll musicians would come in and play for me. Lowell George would come in and play for me anytime.
But can I just say something, Jimmy, to make you feel better, is that what is funny is when you look at the history of that whole Laurel Canyon scene, that a lot of the pivotal stuff was the Monkees, was kind of Mickey Dolenz and Peter Tork. They lived there, and it's like something like, really? I mean, we're talking David Crosby and everything, but no, it was the Monkees. That's where everyone was hanging.
The Monkees, yeah.
So Tommy
don't
Boyce feel so bad.
There was some, thank you for that. There were good songwriters involved in that Monkees thing, and Tommy Boyce and Bobby Hart wrote "I'm a Believer."
Carole King,
to me, great stuff.
I think where you were going is about Galveston, because the lyrics got changed from your original song slightly.
I'm not clear on where.
There's something when Glenn did Galveston, the lyric was slightly changed from when it was originally. Who did the first recording of that?
Well, it was him.
It was him.
Yeah, it was him. But he, I don't know about that song specifically, but I just say, generally speaking, that most of the artists that I've dealt with have made changes to my songs. They've had, sometimes it can be a small thing where, it's like, I don't want to sing about him, I want to sing about her. That's fine, sing about her, I don't care. But Glenn had things. Well, I'll tell you what a reference you may have. You may have a reference to By the Time I Get to Phoenix, because the end of By the Time I Get to Phoenix was fairly prosaic. She just didn't know I would really go.
Yeah.
What they call the tritone, the devil's note. That I would really go, that half step. I had a completely straight ending on it. And I put it, he just didn't know I would really go. I would really go. Just like that. It even sounds wrong. It's hard for me to sing now. And he said, listen, why don't we put an A chord there? He says, what if it went like this? I would really go. And I said, well, okay, that's fine. Let's do that. Then anytime you listen to the very end of By the Time I Get to Phoenix, that's Glenn. And that's him doing his producing thing. He's hearing, he's going, it's good, but just, we need an ending.
Frank Sinatra definitely changed one of your lyrics, didn't he?
Yes, he did. But I honestly, I can't remember which one he did. But
and didn't we? I think
it was a common practice. It's almost like everybody.
But
right?
to get Frank.
Yeah. But I don't think
young
that
when you got Frank. Yeah.
I don't think that I was disappointed with anything he did, because I was so in awe of him.
I believe. Well, I love but you still refer to him as Mr. Sinatra, don't you? I believe.
I do, because when I met him, I was a teenager, and he really was Mr. Sinatra. In a social sense, I was brought up. It was Mr. Sinatra, and then I got the relationship. I knew him for like 50 years. The relationship progressed to the point where I was in my 30s, and I'm still calling him Mr. Sinatra, because I didn't know, once you're calling him Mr. Sinatra, how do you show up at the next soiree and say, hey, Frank, how you doing? I was afraid
Frankie, baby.
I was afraid I would end up in a dumpster somewhere.
Horse's head.
I just stayed with Mr. Sinatra. It seemed to it fit his larger than life status.
But how was it sitting with Frank and playing songs to him?
At first it seemed very strange. It was, I'm talking about, I'm a country kid. I described the Panhandle. That's, where I came from. There was nothing there, guys. I mean, people say, what was it like? And I said, well, it was nothing. There was, what do you mean nothing? Well, there was nothing there. Well, there must have been something there. No, there was nothing there. So to say I was on pins and needles around him would be, I don't know, an understatement. But as time went by, he would call me. He got stuck in Australia one time. He said something unflattering about the prime minister or something, and they grounded his jet. And he was stuck there for like a couple of 3 weeks. You can look this up, because they wouldn't let him take off until he apologized, right? Well, he's Mr. Sinatra. He's not going to apologize to anybody. And
love it.
So the plane sat on the runway, and while it was sitting there, one day, it happened to be my birthday, August 15th, and the phone rang, and it was him. He was calling me from Australia, and I guess he was just going through his Rolodex and calling everybody. But he called him and said, happy birthday, kid. Wow. He said, I'll see you when I get back to town. So he would call me, and then we would occasionally, we might dine together. I remember him taking my father and I to the Jockey Club in Las Vegas for dinner. And you just become closer with someone. And he got to the point where he'd answer the door in his bathrobe and with a power shake in one hand and a cigarette in the other, and we would at the Waldorf. He had a place at the Waldorf here in New York, and we could see from his window, we could see across the Hudson River to that neighborhood.
Hoboken. No, that's where he's from.
Hoboken. I'm sorry.
Oh, Hoboken. All right. Okay. Yeah.
Something's broken in my Hoboken. Anyway, and we're standing there looking at Hoboken, and he said, "You know something, kid?" I said, "No." No. And he said, "Let's go Hoboken over there." And he says, "It's a lot easier to get from here to Hoboken than it is to get from Hoboken to here."
Very good. Also, one last point on Frank. Yeah, but it must. I mean, this not just for you, but as a wider point, the fact that he would always name check the writer before he sang a song, or certainly before he
gave me a shout out on his live album, which was like 1969, 1970. A Man and His Music, and he said, and this was by that great kid Jimmy Webb. Well, that's gold, man. That's gold. I mean, that converts directly into hard cash. It's like he mentions your name on a record. You're going places, whether you like it or not. And but he loved songwriters. He loved what they did, and it was my roots in this traditional pool of pure songwriters that put me in his orbit and made that relationship possible. It also made it possible for me to work with Rosemary Clooney and Billy Eckstine and lots of people. But at the same time, I was always pressing. I mean, the first breakthrough was when I got a song recorded by Artie Garfunkel after he broke up with Paul. Mm-hmm. The very first single he put out, once he gave up on films and he came back to singing, the first song he put out was All I Know, which was mine. And it went to number 3. So all of a sudden, the door to rock and roll kind of opened a crack. And I was able to suddenly. I was hanging out with David Crosby and Graham Nash, and I went on tour with America.
Harry Nilsson, you were hanging out with?
Well, Harry was, it's hard for me to talk about him because we were like brothers for a while. Until he found John Lennon, then he jilted me and went off with John.
But weren't you part of John's Lost Weekend?
but then after John, he came back to me. So I think he loved me best. But anyway, no, I mean, just joking. I'm just joking around. I suddenly found myself actually right in the middle of the stew pot of Los Angeles rock and roll. I was there. I wasn't anywhere near as successful as any of the other guys, but they would hang out with me. They would come in and sing on my records. And Gary Kellgren, who ran the record plant, he thought I was okay. I ended up doing the 10th anniversary. I was musical director for the 10th anniversary of Rolling Stone magazine, and got to know Jan. And Jan thought I was okay. He thought I passed muster, even though don't look for me in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
I feel like we've got little time left with you, and there are 2 big chunks missing here. That you really starting off as the only white writer on Motown. And you were a kid. You were 17. Did you have a relationship with Berry Gordy? Was he was he the boss, or were you?
Well, I didn't. First of all, I wasn't at Motown East. I wasn't in Detroit. I was in Los Angeles. So Motown had an office there.
Joe Betts, wasn't it? It was called
Joe Bett Music, and was their publishing arm, and I was signed to them, and for a while. A couple of years.
But how do you get there? From Nebraska, how do you get... That's your first job. You're like from nowhere to Motown in LA. I mean, there's a big gap there.
It involves a lot of
it's like going from Hoboken to New York, Manhattan.
It's a long walk. It's a long walk, gentlemen. It's a lot of walking. It's a lot of doors slamming. It's a lot of, no, we don't want to air your stuff. We don't care. It's a lot of that. And then it's the one day that you walk in and you never dared to go to Motown because what do they want? Guys like me over there. And they open the door and they play one song and they say, would you be one of our writers? Would you work with us? Like falling off a log. I don't know. My wife is handing me a reminder here that I are you guys going to mention my concerts?
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you have them? Yeah,
we have the dates.
We will definitely mention them. We'll mention them.
Cadogan Hall on May the 28th.
Yeah.
London 28th is the Cadogan Hall. Hamburg, June the 3rd, the Elbphilharmonie, part of Andre Heller's festival.
Is Copenhagen, and there's no date here for this gig. Hamburg.
Yeah, June the 3rd. It's June the 3rd. Is Hamburg.
Yeah, June. There are a few tickets left there.
Jimmy, can I just get you back into Motown for a second? Because that's when you left Motown. You ended up with a pool of songs that would make you a wealthy man for the rest of your life, which is extraordinary.
Well, when I walked out, the interesting thing was they had tried for a while. I got a cut on a Supremes album, a Christmas song called My Christmas Tree, which is a really innovative, interesting title for a song. Anyway, they cut it. And so I had a Supremes record, which wasn't shabby for, first time out. And I worked with, as I said, Billy Eckstein there, worked with Brenda Holloway and Mark Gordon, who was the president on the West Coast, had a bunch of kids called the Versatiles. He went over to Johnny Rivers Music, who was starting a label called Soul City, which sounds a little bit like Motown, Soul City. So when he left Motown, I left. They just cleaned house. And I remember the day I left, they said, okay, so we've got a bunch of songs here that we're going to let you walk with them because this is an amazing thing for them to do. I mean, most of the time in this business, if you've got songs, you just grab them and hang on to them for dear life. Walter Yetnikoff gave Billy Joel his whole catalog back. I mean, that's one of the miracles of the.
Yeah.
I don't even know how to address that. So I'm leaving, and they say, okay, well, Jimmy, look, we're not going to do these songs, so we're going to let you have these songs. Just by the time I get to Phoenix, we're not going to use that. This Up, Up, and Away, we're not going to use it. We're never going to cut that. And we went down a list of Galveston. We're never going to cut that.
My God. I can't believe you'd written all those.
Almost every single song that they put in my backpack, I didn't know, but almost every single one was a hit.
Wow.
And there were some interesting conversations between Mr. Gordy and the staff of the West Coast branch of Motown.
You did what? There's one other song we've got to address, surely, Gary, isn't there?
Oh, that's exactly where I was trying to lead it because I know I don't know how much time you've got there, Jimmy, but obviously, MacArthur Park has to be spoken about. I mean, this is a song.
Well, I've got plenty of time for you guys, so don't worry about me.
I mean, that was a song that blew our minds, wasn't it? As young men, wasn't it, Guy?
Yeah, completely.
I mean, just the conceptual quality of it.
Because also that's the one that perfect. It's so psychedelic that plonks you right on the right side of the argument you were having back then
with the harpsichord.
Let me start with a little anecdote about Van Dyke Parks. Van Dyke Parks, who was writing with Brian Wilson, and came up with this also epic idea called Surf's Up, which had several different music. And there was one line in it in particular that goes, columnated ruins domino, carriage across the fog. So Mike, he was always, I don't know where I dare say this, but Mike Love was the hard ass in that group. he wanted everything to be just so. So he calls Van Dyke Park in one day and says, "What's this colonnaded ruins domino? What does that mean? And what is carriage across? What does any of this? None of this has anything to do with surf, with the surf. It's called Surf's Up. But there's no surf." He's really chewing him out. And the story goes that Van Dyke got up, said, "Sir," he said, "I have no excuse." And that was the end of that conversation. So many times I have been asked, "What does the cake out in the rain mean?" And I say, "I have no excuse." And
are you suggesting, though, Jimmy, as well, that there was an slight inspiration to do an elongated operatic cantata type song that had changes?
It was in the air. It was in the air. It was going to happen. Bones House said to me, "We need something classical." He said, it needs to have movements. And he says, "I can't get anybody to write it." I said, "I'll write it." And he said, "Okay," for the association, actually.
Right.
And so since they were childhood heroes, I thought, oh, man, this is going to be one of the big moments.
That'll be $1 million.
And the thing is that I have to tell you this because I know you want to be somewhat serious about this, but the music business is not very serious. And I went in to play the song for them, and I had on these tight bell-bottom trousers. You've seen them. You know, they're really tight across the butt. You know, and then they get bigger as you go down. And so, and I was not overweight. I was a skinny child at that time. And yet I went in to play MacArthur Park, and as I unfolded it, and it's this wide, you know, it's as wide as the dripping off the piano on both sides. They're doing, holy cow, what's going on here? And as I sat down, the bottom of my trousers ripped out with a sound like Errol Flynn sort of cutting a sail, you know, when he like sadagging the sail. And it was the biggest rip you've ever heard in your life. And those guys went hysterical on me. They started laughing, and I'm thinking, oh, now I go into this very somber minor key, and I start playing. You know, spring was never waiting for us girl around. And they passed. They didn't want to do it. They were late in an album, and besides that, my pants ripped.
Yeah.
Late in the album. In those days, you gentlemen will remember, I know you're just young shaders, but you will remember that records had grooves in them, and you could only put so many grooves on the side of a record without losing fidelity on
20 minutes max.
Yeah, you had to go one way or the other, right? And so as the last song on the album, it was a poison pill for them. It would have ruined the fidelity on one side of their album was going to be ruined if they did it.
Because you have to drop all the bass out of the music.
And it's like association. I know the rumors are out there. I love you guys, always loved you guys. I never held it against you. Please, let's leave it right there. Love you. If you need a song, they're out of business. Forgot. Anyway, I liked them. I liked them a lot because I liked the fact that they played hollow body guitars.
Yeah, but it was sunshine pop as well, and it was an inspiration for you to write Up and Away.
Yeah,
for Fifth Dimension. It was
and,
that sort of vibe.
Never My Love was a great ballad for that time. Songwriters will do that. They get prejudiced against certain songs. Like if they get a turn down, that's one thing. If they get two turn downs, that song may never be played again. It just goes to the bottom of the stack, and that's where it was. And when I went over to London to talk to Richard Harris about doing an album with him, which is...
Because you're just buddies, right? It sounds like you're kind of drinking buddies, or he's the drinking part of the drinking buddies.
Well, when I met him, I really have to sort of capsulize this. I met him in L.A. doing a benefit for peace against the war in Vietnam. And Johnny sent me over there to play the piano, and I found myself surrounded by these old Hollywood stars. Edward G. Robinson was there. Walter Pidgeon was there. Mia Farrow, well, she was a child. Mia Farrow was there. And I did a song, Going Home, Going Home. I am going home. You know, does that ring a bell with you guys? You know that one?
Yeah, I think so.
In our country, it was a Civil War song. And I played the piano for Walter Pidgeon, and he sang it. And Richard was the director. And the first time I ever saw Richard, he was dressed like a hairy caveman. He was standing on a platform, and he swung across the stage, going, "Oh," you know, like this. And I thought, the hell is this? Is this a person or what? You know, he came down. Jimmy Webb, you won't mind if I go here, Jimmy Webb, and we no. And he always called me Jimmy Webb. Never Jimmy, never Webb. And he said, Jimmy Webb. He said, tonight after the rehearsal, he said, we'll go out and we'll have a couple of drinks. You do drink, don't you, Jimmy? Well, not very much, not really. He said, well, we'll have a drink. We'll have a black velvet. You guys know what a black velvet is?
Champagne and Guinness.
Yeah.
He liked champagne and Guinness.
Yeah.
So we're drinking champagne and Guinness. And after about 3 or 4 of those, I hit the floor. I mean, I was not a drinker. But I hasten to add, he turned me into a professional grade drinker in I would say record time. I took to it like a fish to water, you might say. And we just got to be the best mates. He sent me a telegram from London one time saying, "Dear Jimmy Webb, come to London, make record, love Richard." So the tickets were there. The flight tickets were there. And I had never been anywhere. The first place I ever went was London. London's my home away from home. Overall, I've spent years there. But so I went over, and I'm staying with him at 37 Chesham Place in this, I don't know, I'm in the nicest neighborhood in London. I just know that the soap smells different, and I packed my suitcase with all this British soap and took it home. And I had in my suitcase, leather. I had about 20 copies of Dixie Chicken by Little Feat. Oh yeah, it was I wanted to see what the maybe the Beatles would think of that. At any rate, I'm his roommate. Now I'm Richard's roommate. They would sit downstairs in the living room, and we would start drinking. And he liked to drink cognac straight up. And we sat in front of the fire as he would progressively demolish this bottle of Napoleon brandy. He would begin to shed clothing, so the scarf would come off, and then the outer shirt would come off, then the shoes would come, then the socks would come off. Then eventually, guys, the pants would come off. So he's sitting there, and I said, "Listen, I've had enough of this." I said, "I'm going upstairs." So I went upstairs to take a bath with English soap. And I must have fallen asleep in the bed. And I hear like a tremendous uproar downstairs. And this is a quiet neighborhood, very posh. And there's something going on that shouldn't be going on. I go down to the front door. Oh, my God. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. I go down to the front door, and there's a cab driver there, and he's holding up Mr. Harris. And Mr. Harris is in his underwear. And he says, "I find this bloke," he said, he's out in the middle of the King's Road singing that he's going to get himself killed. Oh, my God. He had the cab driver had gathered him up and thankfully, brought him home.
It's amazing.
And he came into the house and just collapsed on the floor. I just left him there.
My God!
And he was a huge guy.
But when did you first play him the song?
we're sitting in there one day and going through a bunch of songs, and he said, "Well, that one's okay, Jimmy Webb, and this one's okay. That one's not so good. Nah, I couldn't do that. I couldn't do it. I don't do it." Then finally, I sort of played a few minor chords, and I went, "Spring was never waiting for us, girl. It ran one step ahead." And he went, wham, like this with his hand on the piano. Wham! He says, "I'll have that. I'll have that. I'll make a hit out of it. I'll be a pop star. I'll be a pop star."
Wow, what a story.
You'll see. You're fantastic.
Everything he ever said like that came true. If he said something, you better be listening, because he was underneath all the, in a certain sense, the clownish behavior. He was extremely steely-minded, tough guy. There was one point in the business when he couldn't get a job. They literally would not, Cassandra Crossing, that awful movie he made, and after that, it was very difficult for him to get a job. But you see where he finished? He finished as Dumbledore, the king of the wizards, and he also finished. He played Camelot live on the road. They had 2 trucks, and they could put Camelot on one truck, and they put Richard and not Galahad, but Lancelot. Richard and Lancelot and Guinevere rode in the other truck, and they would go from town to town doing Camelot. Now, I think they had a couple of guys who played like guards. A very, very pared down version of Camelot. Amazing. And he made over $6 million in 3 years.
Wow.
Jimmy, I got one last question from me, and it's you always talk about growing up and your piano teacher and you becoming a great skilled pianist. Your piano playing is incredible. We all know your power of your melody. The one thing you don't talk about, and I think it's what makes you the greatest songwriter of all, are your lyrics and how that fell into place for you, your storytelling and your use of words. I mean, was there a memory? Is there a memory of a way in that happened for you?
It's very, very hard to beat the King James version of the Bible in terms of evoking emotion, and particularly, a man needs to read the Psalms. A man needs to read the Psalms. You can go anywhere. You can write dirty songs for the rest of your life, but you need to start with the Psalms, because the language, the process of using language to evoke a response. Okay, sounds like a really big bubble. But for a songwriter, it's not that tough, because you can take 1 or 2 other people and say, "Hey, come in the cafeteria with me. I want you to hear this." And you can play it and watch them like a hawk. And you can tell whether that song is reaching them or not reaching them. And words have everything to do with that. So a lot of things that young writers don't do today that perhaps they never did, but I certainly did. I was bookish. I read all of Dylan Thomas. I read Patrick Kavanagh, Pablo Neruda, Omar Khayyam. I read Ulysses. There's a lot of people who will tell you, "Oh yeah, I read Ulysses." Ulysses. You got to have guts of steel to read Ulysses. Yeah. That's a big bite, but that's where you learn. Like Ray Bradbury was a mentor for me, because the way he used language and the way he described.
Well, the Moon is a Harsh Mistress is from a Robert Heinlein novel, isn't it?
It's the title of a Robert Heinlein novel. Yeah. It was a series of books. I think it came out as a book at one point called "The Man Who Sold the Moon," but it was all about the moon. The song isn't so much about the book. The book was very political. Yeah. He was always grinding some political axe, but he came up with great uses of phrase. They all did. The science fiction writers were more fun to read than any of the other writers, because of the way they use language. And they would repurpose words and do really kinky stuff at that time. So
Read is what you're saying. Read.
Yeah, I don't know how to get across how important it is, because that's the way you learn to express. Look, we all learn by imitation. So if you like, I used to write songs imitating the songs I heard on the radio. No disrespect to the people who wrote the songs. I'm teaching myself. I'm learning by copying, and then I'm saying, yeah, well, that's a pretty good Burt Bacharach song, not bad. And it used to actually judge my progress on the road of self-fulfillment by my ability to predict what you guys know what I mean when I say a follow-up, but I have to explain that to people now because that's an archaic term. But a follow-up being a record that follows a hit record that sounds a lot like it, but not too much like it, so that you recapture that same audience. That's the philosophy behind it. So you sell another hit record by making it sound like the first one, but not too much like the first one. Well, I would compare my songs to songs I heard on the radio. And when I started hearing parody, and I thought I could have written a better follow-up than that. A kind of Midwestern modesty, but it's strictly veneer.
You sounded actually quite modest, I think, on our chat together. We're going to have to wrap it up, Jimmy.
Oh, no.
I know. Our producers just nudged us.
We could talk to you all
And
day.
also, the other reason is Guy and I have been invited to the screening of Let It Be, the new Peter Jackson restoration of Let It Be, this evening.
Wonderful.
And we're on our way over there any minute now. My wife our carriage awaits.
I'm a great fan of both of you guys, and I thank you for taking time from your careers to talk to me.
We should come. We should go and see him play at Cadogan Hall, shouldn't we?
May the 28th, Cadogan Hall. We'll try and come down. I would dearly love to shake your hand, Jimmy Webb.
You can come hang out with me backstage.
I'd love that. We'd love that. We'll organise it through our producers.
Okay, good deal.
And your wife. Thank you, Jimmy. All the best.
Bye-bye.
Hey, what a guy! Tab on. I mean, literally, I could have kept on going. Really.
There are so many things I want to say, but I just thought, you know what, you just can't. I know, because I felt like I kept jumping in on stuff. But
we're all eager to ask him various questions. I felt the same. But you get what you get with Jimmy. He can go off on a tangent and just. But
it's very funny.
Another wild story.
Talking to him, it makes his lyrics kind of make more sense.
Yeah. It's how his head works.
Yeah.
What a genius. Absolutely a genius. And we are going off to Let It Be, aren't we, to see it?
We are, yeah.
I'm sure by the time this goes out, you all have seen it. You would have gone to Disney and watched it. But we're seeing actual screening in a cinema in London.
Very exciting. But I don't know, but isn't it because it's going to be weird after, because it's, let's talk about it once we've seen it.
Yeah. John Sim's going to be there, our friend John Sim as well. We'll see him.
Oh, nice.
Until then,
it's a good night from me.
It's a good night from them.
Rockonteurs is produced by Gimme Sugar Productions for Warner Music Group UK.